The canvas walls of the field tent rippled in the Pacific breeze, heavy with the smell of disinfectant and damp wood. On a rough wooden bench sat a girl who barely looked old enough to be at war. She was 20, a Japanese nurse's aide pulled into the machine of empire, her uniform torn, her sleeve caked with blood. For 3 days she had carried the certainty of death in her chest. Capture, she had been told, was worse than a bullet. Now, sitting in silence, she braced herself for cruelty. Her instructors had described in vivid detail what awaited her if she fell into American hands: mockery, violation, starvation. Better to die by her own hand, they had said, than to endure such shame. Her commanders had drilled it into every woman's mind. To be taken alive is to cease to exist as Japanese. When the tent flap opened, she clenched her fists, waiting for the blow. Instead, a tall young man in olive drab stepped inside. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He carried a roll of white bandages. The medic knelt in front of her and gently touched her arm. His hands were steady, practiced, not hurried. He muttered words she couldn't understand, but his tone was unmistakable. Not anger, not triumph. Something she hadn't expected at all. Kindness. She flinched when he began to wrap her wound, certain it was some trick. But the cloth was clean, the touch careful. Across the tent, other women, her fellow auxiliaries, sat eating bowls of stew, steam rising into the dim light. She watched as one of them swallowed a mouthful and began to cry, not from pain, but from the sheer shock of eating meat and vegetables after weeks of gnawing hunger. The young nurse stared at her own arm, at the fresh bandage replacing the dirty rag she had tied days before. For a moment, she felt the ground shifting beneath her. Everything she had been told, every word of training, every warning of family and officers, collided with what she was experiencing now. The Americans weren't jeering, they weren't striking, they were feeding, healing, and speaking softly. The confusion was almost unbearable. Outside, she could hear guards exchanging casual conversation. Not the bark of orders, but the steady rhythm of men at routine. A faint smell drifted in with the breeze. Coffee, strong and bitter. She had never tasted it, but she had heard the officers talk about the Americans' obsession with the drink. Now it was here, close enough to touch. She lifted her eyes to the medic. He gave a small nod, a gesture so ordinary it felt impossible. Her heart pounded as though she had entered another world. In truth, she had. This was not the nightmare she had prepared for. It was something far more dangerous to everything she believed. Gentleness from an enemy. And in that moment, with the bandage snug around her arm, she began to wonder if she had been lied to her entire life. Long before the barbed wire, before the canvas tents and steaming bowls of stew, the young nurse and her companions had been bound by something far more unyielding, an oath. It was not written on paper, nor was it signed with ink. It was whispered into their ears during training, repeated until it carved grooves in their minds. Better to die than be captured. The words came from a tradition centuries old, the Bushido Code. What had once belonged to the samurai, to warriors who lived and died by the sword, had been filtered down through generations, until even young women serving as auxiliaries carried its weight. It wasn't presented as a choice. It was duty, honor, and inevitability. To surrender was to bring shame not only on yourself, but on your family, your ancestors, and even the emperor himself. Instructors told them, in tones that brooked no argument, that a captured woman was no longer human. She was an object of ridicule, a mark of disgrace. Her family would bow their heads in dishonor, her name whispered in shame. The nurse had believed it with the devotion of youth. She had stood in a cramped barracks months earlier, reciting the words in chorus with other girls. The room had been cold, the floor rough beneath her knees as they repeated the vow. Death before capture. Some girls whispered with tears in their eyes. Others shouted with fierce pride. But none dared remain silent. The instructors had been explicit about what capture would mean. The enemy, they warned, would treat them with cruelty beyond imagination, starvation, humiliation, violation. Better to slit your own throat with a scalpel than endure such dishonor. Better to swallow poison, to leap from a cliff, to take a grenade to your chest. Anything was preferable to the shame of survival. And yet here she was, alive, a bandage on her arm, food in her stomach, her body still her own. As night fell over the American camp, she lay awake on her bunk, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. The silence itself was strange. No shouted orders, no crack of whips, no barked punishments. Just the quiet hum of guards speaking in low voices outside and the distant sound of a harmonica. Her mind raced. Every lesson, every oath, every speech from her commanders clashed with the reality of what she was seeing. If surrender was dishonor, then why was she treated with dignity? If captivity was supposed to strip her humanity, then why did she feel more human now than she had in years? One thought, dangerous and unspoken, crept into her heart. What if they had lied to us? She closed her eyes, but the question remained, sharper than hunger, heavier than fear. It was the beginning of a crisis that no amount of propaganda could repair. Before the nurse ever saw an American face, before the white bandage on her arm or the steam rising from a bowl of stew, her world had already been shaped by another kind of captivity, her own army's iron grip. She remembered the long marches through jungle heat, where exhaustion was met not with mercy, but with a slap across the face. She remembered standing at attention until her knees shook, while an officer's cane struck down the line, lashing anyone who faltered. To stumble was weakness. To complain was treason. Discipline was taught not through guidance, but through humiliation and pain. Rations were worse than hunger. A fistful of rice, stretched with husks, bark, even sawdust, was all they were given. Meat was a fantasy, vegetables a memory. She had seen soldiers fight over scraps, and others collapse on the roadside, left behind to die because they slowed the march. Compassion was not part of the Japanese way of war. Suffering was. One night she had sat beside a fellow nurse who was feverish, her body trembling from infection. Instead of medical care, the officers barked that she was weak and unworthy. The girl was left on the dirt floor, her moans fading into silence by morning. No funeral, no words, just another body discarded by an army that preached sacrifice above survival. These memories came rushing back now in the stillness of the American camp. She found herself comparing the two worlds without wanting to. On one side, endless hunger and cruelty disguised as honor. On the other, a simple meal, a blanket, and a medic who looked her in the eyes without hatred. The dissonance was unbearable. She had expected brutality from the enemy, and had found it in her own leaders instead. The realization gnawed at her as surely as starvation once had. For the first time, she questioned what honor really meant. Was it loyalty to commanders who had abandoned their wounded? Or could honor be found in survival, in kindness, in the recognition of another's humanity, even if that humanity came from the hands of an enemy? The questions lingered as she lay awake that night. In the darkness, she could still hear her instructors' voices preaching sacrifice and shame. But now, those voices were joined by new ones. The quiet laugh of an American guard outside, the clatter of tin trays being collected after dinner, the memory of soup warming her empty stomach. Two worlds were colliding inside her, and only one of them felt human. The jungle had been full of whispers. Rumors passed like smoke among the Japanese auxiliaries, whispers of what the Americans did to women who fell into their hands. Cruelty, humiliation, worse things too shameful to speak aloud. By the time the young nurse and her companions stumbled into captivity, those whispers were pounding in their heads louder than gunfire. So when the American patrol appeared, rifles slung across their shoulders, the women froze. Some closed their eyes, bracing for the strike of a rifle butt. Others clenched their jaws, determined not to scream no matter what was done to them. The nurse's knees nearly buckled under the weight of her fear, but nothing happened. One of the soldiers, a boy really, barely older than she was, reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette. He held it out, the paper cylinder balanced casually between his fingers. When no one moved, he shrugged and placed it in her hand. Another soldier stepped forward, canteen in hand, unscrewed the cap and offered it with a nod. The water inside was cool, almost sweet after days of thirst. The women stared, bewildered. Was this a trick? Some cruel prelude before the real torment began? The nurse lifted the canteen to her lips with trembling fingers. The water slid down her throat, washing away not only dryness, but a piece of the terror that had gripped her since capture. Then came the medic. He didn't bark orders, didn't leer. He crouched in the dirt beside her, eyes narrowing in concentration as he examined her wounded arm. When she flinched at his touch, he pulled back slightly, speaking in a low, steady tone. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. It's all right. She waited for cruelty. She found care. Behind her, another woman accepted a piece of chocolate wrapped in silver foil. She unwrapped it slowly, suspiciously, then placed a corner on her tongue. Tears welled in her eyes. She whispered that it must be poisoned. Yet the Americans ate the same chocolate without hesitation, laughing among themselves. For the Japanese women, every gesture was a contradiction, every act of kindness an assault on everything they had been taught. Fear was still there, deep, unshakable, but it was now tangled with something more dangerous, doubt. That night, as the prisoners were marched toward camp, the nurse turned the cigarette over in her fingers. She had not smoked it. She wasn't even sure how. But she kept it anyway, hidden in her sleeve. It wasn't just a cigarette anymore. It was proof that the enemy she had been taught to fear might not be the monster she expected. The bandage on her arm had started the unraveling. The cigarette was pulling at the thread. In the weeks that followed their capture, the young nurse and the other women began to see a pattern. Meals arrived with clockwork regularity. Bread, soup, coffee, sometimes even meat and fruit. Wounds were cleaned and dressed. Guards knew their names, not just their numbers. The Americans were not offering luxury, but they were offering life. And for women who had been taught that surrender was worse than death, survival itself felt like a revelation. But beyond the barbed wire, another reality unfolded, a grim contrast that none of them could ignore once whispers began to circulate. They heard it first in hushed voices from interpreters, and later confirmed by scattered news clippings. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were dying by the thousands. The irony was staggering. While these women were handed cigarettes, water, and chocolate, American and British soldiers captured in the Philippines and Southeast Asia were wasting away on starvation rations. While they lay on bunks under real blankets, Allied POWs were crammed into bamboo cages, beaten for the smallest infractions, forced into labor until their bodies gave out. The numbers were brutal. In American camps, less than 1 in 100 Japanese prisoners would die before the war's end. In Japanese camps, nearly 1 in 3 Allied prisoners would never return home. Malaria, cholera, dysentery, diseases untreated. Starvation so severe that men dropped dead on the march. Their bodies left where they fell. The nurse couldn't ignore the stories, not after she herself had been spared hunger and humiliation. When she thought back to the bitter rice husks that had once been her only meal, she understood how fragile life could be. And yet, here, her enemy placed bread in her hands without hesitation. To her, the contrast cut deeper than any wound. Her own commanders had promised that capture by Americans meant degradation. But the reality was reversed. It was her own nation that had stripped humanity from its captives, while the Americans preserved it. At night, lying awake in the quiet barracks, she wondered how many mothers back in Japan believed the propaganda that their sons and daughters were dying honorably. She wondered what those mothers would think if they could see their children alive, eating American stew, drinking American coffee, resting under American blankets, while Allied sons starved in Japanese camps. It was almost unbearable to reconcile, and yet it was the truth. For the women, this realization wasn't just about survival. It was about identity. To be treated as human by the very enemy they had been taught to despise was a revelation too powerful to ignore. The cruelty of comparison was clear. One side built survival into its prison policy. The other built death. And in that truth, a quiet shift began. The enemy was no longer a faceless monster. The lines between right and wrong, honor and shame, began to blur in ways that could never be undone. The first time she lifted the tin cup to her lips, she hesitated. Steam curled upward, carrying with it a scent she had never known, dark, sharp, almost intoxicating. The American medic had placed it in her hands with a small smile, as if offering her something ordinary, something routine. To him, it was nothing more than coffee. To her, it might as well have been poison. She braced herself and took a sip. The bitterness struck her tongue like a blade. She coughed, eyes watering, as the unfamiliar taste clawed at her senses. The medic chuckled softly, shaking his head, amused by her innocence. It was a sound she could never have imagined from an enemy. A warm, human laugh, not a sneer, not the cruelty she had been warned about. And in that small sound, something inside her cracked. The coffee wasn't poison, it wasn't a trick. It was simply bitter, strong, and alive with warmth. She took another sip, slower this time, and felt the heat spread through her chest. For the first time in months, she felt her body truly awaken. The contradiction was unbearable. She had been told Americans were brutes, monsters without honor. Yet here they were, handing her bread, bandaging her wounds, offering her coffee. She thought of her instructors, their harsh voices declaring that capture meant the end of dignity. And then she thought of this moment, where dignity was not stripped away but quietly restored. The other women felt it too. Some clutched chocolate bars as if they were contraband, hiding them in pockets for fear they might vanish. Others wept silently over bowls of stew, ashamed of their own hunger, yet unable to resist. One even whispered that the Americans must be magicians, conjuring food and comfort from a world that had taught them only scarcity. Late that night, lying awake on her bunk, the nurse stared at the rafters above. The taste of coffee still lingered on her tongue. And with it came questions too dangerous to ignore. If surrender was not dishonor, what then was honor? If the Americans were not monsters, who had been lying to her? If compassion could exist here, behind barbed wire, what did that say about the war itself? Her world was unraveling, thread by thread. The Bushido code that had once felt unbreakable now seemed fragile, brittle, almost absurd. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the unthinkable, that her enemy might be more human than the leaders who had demanded her sacrifice. The crisis of belief had begun, and there would be no going back. The first night in camp felt like stepping into another world. The women had been led through the gates under the watchful eyes of guards, their footsteps dragging, their minds still locked in fear. But instead of cages or cold floors, they were shown to long barracks lined with wooden bunks. Each bunk held a thin mattress, a folded blanket, and a pillow, things so ordinary to the Americans that they barely noticed them. To the nurse, it was overwhelming. She sat down slowly, afraid the bed might vanish if she touched it too quickly. The mattress gave beneath her weight, soft in a way that felt indecent after months of sleeping on bamboo mats or bare ground. She gripped the blanket in her hands, the fabric rough but real, and pulled it against her chest as if it might disappear. For the first time since her capture, she felt her body relax. It was a sensation so foreign it frightened her. Comfort, she had been told, was weakness. Pain was proof of loyalty. Yet here she was, her wounds wrapped in clean bandages, her stomach warm with food, her body resting on something soft. It felt like betrayal of everything she had been taught to endure. Around her, other women were equally unsettled. One lay stiff as a board, too afraid to lie fully down. Another pressed her face into the pillow and began to weep, the sound muffled, raw, unstoppable. A third laughed suddenly, a sharp, almost hysterical sound, and then clapped a hand over her mouth in fear of punishment. But no punishment came. The guards outside didn't storm in. No officer's cane struck down. The only response was silence, and that silence was the most disorienting thing of all. They were used to nights filled with the bark of orders, the crack of discipline, the groans of the dying. Here the camp settled into a hush broken only by the distant murmur of American voices and the faint notes of a harmonica drifting on the night air. The nurse lay back at last, staring at the ceiling beams above her. The blanket warmed her shoulders. The mattress held her body, and in that fragile comfort, her thoughts tumbled into dangerous territory. If the enemy could give her rest instead of pain, food instead of hunger, warmth instead of cold, then what else had been a lie? The silence pressed against her like a question she could not answer. She closed her eyes, not because she wanted to sleep, but because the confusion was too heavy to bear. Sleep came anyway, deeper and more peaceful than any she had known in years. And as the barracks settled into slumber, one truth began to crystallize. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't a rifle or a bomb, it's kindness. A week into captivity, the nurse was given something she never expected, a pencil and a sheet of paper. The American guard handed it to her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His words, through an interpreter, were simple. "You may write to your family." At first, she stared at the blank page in disbelief. All her training had insisted this was impossible. The enemy would never let a prisoner speak freely, never allow a letter to cross the ocean. Communication was power, and power was something prisoners did not deserve. Yet here it was, a pencil, sharpened to a fine point, waiting in her hand. Her fingers trembled as she pressed it to the paper. For a long time, no words came. What could she say to her mother, who had been told her daughter must die before being captured? What could she write that would not bring shame to her family's name? At last, the words spilled out in careful strokes. "Mother, I am alive. They feed me, they treat me kindly. I do not understand this war anymore." The sentence was simple, but as she read it back, tears blurred the lines. It was the first time she had admitted, even to herself, that the world she had believed in was collapsing. The Americans were not monsters. They were not torturers. They were men who laughed, who handed out cigarettes, who gave her bread and coffee, who let her write to her mother. Other women wrote their own letters, each one a small rebellion against the lies they had been told. Some wrote cautiously, "I am safe." Others poured out their disbelief. "The enemy gives us more food than our own officers." One even confessed, "It feels like a dream." None of them knew if the letters would ever reach their families. Many would be intercepted by Japanese intelligence, studied in silence by officers who feared the truth they contained. To those men, the letters were dangerous, more dangerous than any bullet. For if word spread that captivity could be survivable, even humane, the entire foundation of Bushido might crumble. The nurse folded her page carefully, her hand lingering on the words she had written. She had expected her capture to end her story. Instead, it had given her voice to tell a new one. Behind barbed wire, with guards watching from the towers, she had found something she never expected to hold again, the freedom to speak the truth. And in that truth, a new kind of strength began to take root. Days in the American camp soon fell into a rhythm. The women woke not to shouted orders or the crack of a cane, but to the clang of a bell calling them to breakfast. They filed into the mess hall, uncertain at first, and were handed trays lined with food that seemed impossibly abundant. Eggs, bread, butter, fruit, steaming mugs of coffee, the sort of meal that Japanese soldiers at the front could only dream of. The nurse remembered how, just months earlier, she had eaten weeds pulled from ditches to quiet her stomach. Now she sat at a wooden table, biting into warm bread so soft it nearly melted on her tongue. Across from her, another nurse wept silently as she chewed, overwhelmed not by hunger, but by the realization of being fed without fear. After breakfast, There was work to be done, laundry, sweeping, helping in the infirmary, but none of it carried the cruelty of the labor she had known under Japanese officers. There were no shouted insults, no slaps for moving too slowly. Tasks were supervised, yes, but with efficiency, not humiliation. It was as if the Americans believed order could be maintained without breaking the spirit of those under their control. Afternoons brought something stranger still, leisure. Some guards played music on portable radios. The crackling voices of singers carried through the camp. On rare occasions, one even pulled out a harmonica and filled the air with a mournful tune that reminded the women of home, not because the melody was Japanese, but because it carried the same aching loneliness. There were books, too, though few could read the English words. Still, some women traced the letters with their fingers, fascinated by the idea that prisoners could be allowed access to such things at all. To them, even the presence of paper and ink was a symbol of freedom they had been denied in their own army. Yet the comparisons never stopped. Whispers still reached the camp about Allied POWs in Japanese hands. Men starved, beaten, worked until death. The irony grew sharper each day. While American guards served their prisoners hot meals, Japanese guards starved theirs. While these women lay on bunks under blankets, Allied prisoners collapsed on bare ground, their bones jutting beneath their skin. The nurse often thought of it at night, lying awake under her blanket. She imagined an American soldier, perhaps captured in the Philippines, staring at a handful of moldy rice while she chewed fresh bread. The thought made her chest tighten with guilt, though she had no power to change it. Life in the camp was not paradise. It was still captivity. But compared to the horrors she had been taught to expect, it was something close to unimaginable mercy. And in that mercy, the women began to rediscover pieces of themselves that had been buried under fear, laughter, conversation, even the faint flicker of hope. One evening, as the sun sank low and the harmonica played again in the distance, the nurse realized something astonishing. For the first time since the war began, she did not feel like a shadow waiting to vanish. She felt alive, and that perhaps was the cruelest irony of all, that captivity at the hands of the enemy had given her back her humanity. It happened after dinner on an ordinary evening. The women had finished their trays of stew and bread, and the nurse sat quietly, savoring the feeling of a stomach no longer clawed by hunger. Around her, the others sat in silence, still wary of showing too much emotion in front of the guards. But then one of the younger auxiliaries let out a sound no one expected. A laugh. It was sharp at first, almost defiant, and every head snapped toward her. For a moment, she clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide in terror, waiting for punishment. But the guards didn't move. They didn't bark orders or raise fists. One of them simply looked over, puzzled, then went back to stacking trays. The silence stretched, and then the girl laughed again, this time louder, freer. She pointed at her tray, at the last scrap of bread she had been saving. "Too much," she whispered in Japanese, shaking her head. "I cannot eat another bite." It was absurd, laughter over a full stomach when not long ago they had fought over weeds and scraps. But the absurdity itself broke something open. Another woman chuckled, then another. Soon, the barracks echoed with the sound of laughter that had been buried for years under fear and discipline. The nurse felt it rise in her own chest, unwilling at first, then unstoppable. She laughed until tears stung her eyes, until her ribs ached. It was not the cruel laughter of mockery, nor the hollow laughter of desperation. It was pure, human, and alive. The guards glanced over now and then, their expressions unreadable. Perhaps they thought the women were mocking them. Or perhaps they understood something deeper, that laughter itself was a kind of healing. For the women, the moment was dangerous. It felt like betrayal to laugh in captivity, to find joy in the company of the enemy. Yet it also felt like liberation. For a few minutes, they were not prisoners, not soldiers, not pawns of an empire. They were simply young women who had survived, who had eaten their fill, who had discovered that even in war, life could still hold moments of light. When the laughter finally faded, the nurse sat back on her bunk, breathless and shaken. She realized that hatred, so carefully cultivated by her commanders, was fragile. It could be broken not by speeches or battles, but by something as simple as kindness, a warm meal, and the freedom to laugh without fear. That night, as the barracks settled into silence, the memory of laughter lingered like an ember, small, fragile, but glowing all the same. And in that ember lay the beginning of something the war itself could not destroy: humanity. The war dragged on outside the fences, but inside the camp a quieter revolution was taking shape, one written in pencil on thin sheets of paper, hidden in diaries, whispered in conversations between women who had once sworn to die rather than surrender. Those letters and words, fragile as they seemed, would outlive the barbed wire. Months after the young nurse first wrote to her mother, more letters followed. Each one carried a similar message. We are alive. We are fed. The enemy treats us better than our own officers did. These words traveled across oceans, some reaching families, others intercepted by Japanese authorities who read them with silent dread. For propaganda to survive, truth had to be silenced. Yet truth has a way of slipping through cracks. Years later, when the war had ended and the world was reckoning with its wounds, historians uncovered those letters and diaries. And they were astonished by the detail, the candor, the raw humanity in the words of women who had once been hidden behind the rising sun's iron code. One diary, written in cramped Japanese script, described the shock of tasting chocolate for the first time. Another told of a blanket so warm it made the writer cry, because she realized she had never known comfort without fear. Yet another letter confessed that the hardest thing to reconcile was not cruelty from the enemy, but kindness. And these documents did more than preserve memory. They became evidence that America's strength was not only in the steel of factories, the roar of bombers, or the firepower of fleets. It was also in the quiet discipline of mercy. While Japanese camps had left Allied prisoners broken, starving, and dying by the thousands, American camps had done the opposite. They had preserved life, even dignity, for enemies sworn to fight to the death. That fact alone shook survivors to their core. For the young nurse, the realization came slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. She had expected her story to end in shame, in silence. Instead, her words, and those of her companions, were now carried forward as testimony. Their very survival became part of the larger story of how compassion could be a weapon more powerful than brutality. Even long after she returned home, even as Japan struggled to rise from the ruins, the memories lingered. The bandage on her arm, the taste of bitter coffee, the weight of a blanket, the sound of laughter in captivity. Each one was a reminder that the war had been fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with choices about how to treat the defeated. Those choices had echoed far beyond the wire. When the nurse looked back on her captivity, years after the war had ended, one phrase returned to her again and again: a paradise behind barbed wire. It was not paradise in the sense of freedom. After all, she was still a prisoner. She could not walk beyond the gates, could not return to her family, could not choose her own path. Yet within those fences, she had discovered something she had never known in her own army, in her own country, or in the war itself: humanity. It began with a bandage on her arm. It deepened with the taste of bitter coffee, the warmth of a blanket, the chance to write a letter home. It grew in the sound of laughter, the sharing of meals, the small acts of mercy that slowly unraveled the lies she had carried since childhood. What she had expected to be torture became healing. What she had feared would be shame became survival. What she thought would strip her dignity had instead restored it. For the Americans, perhaps it was all routine. To them, feeding prisoners, giving medical care, allowing letters, even permitting music and rest, these were obligations under the Geneva Convention, nothing extraordinary. But to her and the other women, it was nothing less than a revelation. The war had taught her to expect cruelty, to see the enemy as monsters. Captivity had shown her the opposite, that true strength is not only measured in bombs dropped or battles won, but in the choice to show mercy when no one would have blamed you for showing none. That choice, the American choice, was what lingered longest. When she later told her story, people asked her how it felt to be a prisoner. She would pause, searching for words, and then smile faintly. It was not freedom, she would say, but it was paradise compared to what we feared. And so, the legacy of those women, nurses, auxiliaries, prisoners of war, was not just survival. It was testimony. Testimony that kindness can shatter indoctrination, that mercy can outlast hatred, and that sometimes the most powerful victory comes not from the battlefield, but from the quiet, stubborn insistence on treating an enemy as human. Behind barbed wire, they had discovered the greatest irony of war, that humanity itself can be the sharpest weapon of all. And now I'd like to hear from you. What do you think this story tells us about mercy in the middle of war? Do you believe kindness can be as powerful as any weapon? Share your thoughts down in the comments. I read every one of them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll never miss the next untold chapter of World War II history. We've got more incredible stories coming, tales of courage, survival, and moments that changed the course of the war in ways you won't believe. So hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join me next time for another journey into the hidden corners of the Second World War.